Thanks everybody for coming out. I know that PAX is kind of the main part of PAX is sort of closed-ish, but I appreciate everybody sticking around for this talk. I hope it's entertaining for you. And the one thing I know when I talk about this topic is often when I give this topic in scientific circles, I'm not really preaching to the converted. Here, I don't think there's a lot here I'm going to say that's going to ruffle your guys' feathers, but I think it's important for you to see where the science is on violence, video games, and kids. There is a scientific controversy about this. My name is Tyler Black. I'm a psychiatrist at BC Children's Hospital, which is in Vancouver, British Columbia. We're warmer and less snowy. I'm not happy with the Boston snow. It's that hard, disgusting snow that just hasn't gone anywhere. My email address is there, and I've left some business cards at the table on the way out as well, in case anybody has questions afterwards, and you don't want to stick around or go to another panel or something like that. Feel free to send me a question over email or any discussion or anything like that. So I work on a unit at BC Children's called the CAPE unit, which is a Child and Adolescent Psychiatric Emergency unit. So we're a unit for BC Children's Hospital where any kid under the age of 17 with a psychiatric emergency gets admitted to the ward that I work on. I'm the medical director of that unit, and I've seen a lot of things related to video games, but it's usually in the parents' eyes. Usually when I peel it back, it's a little bit less than that. I am giving a talk tomorrow on parenting and video games, which will be a more broader look at the effect of video games on kids with respect to problem gaming, violence in video games, and the rating systems and those types of things. My hope is, oh, that is really, really dark. My hope is that I can give you guys a little bit of a historical context of this whole idea of entertainment causing violence in kids, because it turns out it's really old, like 3 millennia old. It's 3 millennia old, and this is something that has been just talked about forever with respect to media harming our children. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the media does and show you how the media can really distort what science says. And I'm also going to tell you a little bit about how the science can actually have a political agenda as well, and that's what's been happening recently. Every time you give a talk, you have to disclose your competing interests when you're an academic person. That means I have to let you guys know what my biases are. These are all the video game systems that I've owned or currently own. I always give a bit of a PAX story as well, just to show that I'm actually a gamer. I have my badge signed by Casey Hudson, which is a really big deal to me. My bag is a Mass Effect bag. So I'm a gamer, and that's one thing that has been the most frustrating thing. Even before I became a doctor, as I was reading the research on this, just seeing all this, these scientific reports saying that video games cause violence, and I'm like, I was 6 years old and I was playing car crashing games where I literally just crashed the car just for fun. And never did I think, boy, it'd be really fun to do this in real life. Even at 6, I knew the difference between reality and a video game. But like I say, this actually goes way back. I hope that silhouette is somewhat, well, you can't see it at all. It'll become more obvious in a bit. So in 400 BC, Plato actually argued that poetry would have deleterious effects on youth. He said things like it'll cause murder, incest, cruelty, treachery, uncontrolled passions, weakness, cowardice, and malice. And that's poetry, which we all teach in school today. We don't have any qualms with that. The works of Shakespeare. William Henry Pride was writing a review of Shakespeare's play. And these are all the things that you would become if you watched a Shakespeare play. A whore, a body, a pander, a ruffian. Actually, some of these are awesome names. I want these as gamer tags or titles in an RPG or something like that. The novel. So when The Monk came out by Matthew Lewis, it was described as a poison for youth, that it would provoke no improvement for the intellect. It fills the mind with a mawkish and morbid sensibility to destroy the reasoning and the powers of the mind. In the 20th century, we've seen this replaced with things like jazz music. In the 1920s, there are actually scientific articles on jazz babies. And the idea here came about, there was a media panic because there was a Salvation Army that opened right next to a theater. And that theater converted to a jazz theater. And the community was in uproar because this Salvation Army was also an orphanage. And the fear was that the jazz music would lead to discoordinated babies because the music was offbeat. And there were actually a number of scientific articles showing that jazz music would cause movement disorders in children. And today, we look back at jazz and we go, oh, that's kind of old, chill stuff. Like, that would be fine. Like, I'd play Jazz Standy Baby now. But at the time, it was a really big deal. The National Association for Music in Hospitals, and this is a real thing, there is a National Association for Music in Hospitals, proclaimed jazz as taboo. The music wrongfully rendered and only served to upset patients. The association said that the music's jerky and unrestful nature would cause disruptive effects and urged its physicians never to play or mention jazz. So this was an official body in the 20th century talking about how jazz music was going to destroy kids. Rock and roll, this one's obvious. Elvis Presley, his nickname, you guys probably know this, it was, colloquially, Elvis the Pelvis. It was all this pelvis thrusting stuff. And this idea that kids would just start fornicating like crazy because they'd seen Elvis Presley and they couldn't control their urges. People had this idea that coffee bars, the beatnik generation was all about hanging out in coffee bars and talking about overthrowing the government. The establishment saw that as, oh, coffee bars are the problem. It's not that, we're a shitty government or that we're too controlling really untitled. It's that coffee bars are the problem. Television, debuted in 1948, but there really was a correlation between crime rate boom and sort of the advent of television, and people really started freaking out about the effects of television. And there's still lots of articles today talking about media violence, and some of them are conflated with the video game stuff I'll present. And now, of course, we have video games. Just a sec, wait a second. Video games, there's actually been 7 generations of video game systems. And the very first generation was a very primitive system. I'm blanking on the name of it. It was the one that had the gun attachment. It was just a series of lights. You had to put a tape over the TV. What's that? Odyssey, yes, thank you, the Odyssey. It literally was so primitive that if you wanted to create an arena for like hockey, you had to put tape over your TV with holes in it where the lights would shine through the holes and tell you what to do. But the very first attachment ever made for a video game was a gun. And one of the first games was an archery game. And the idea here was that kids were going to be doing this, a hunting game. These kids would be hunting on the TV and it would create these killers. So this has been talked about since the 70s. And the concept here is what we call the moral panic wheel. This is actually a relatively well-studied thing. And it's so obvious when we talk about video games. But basically you have a societal belief. And right now the societal belief is video games are bad. You guys, that's not your belief. But if I were to poll the universe right now, the sentient universe, I'd say, yeah, video games are not a good thing. Kids are playing too much video games. Video games are too violent. There's this media and social and current pervasive belief that video games are bad. So, any politician that wants to get reelected, even, moderate, even though she's fairly conservative, Democrats like Hillary Clinton, will stand up and say, we're going to reduce violence in video games. That's a very easy pandering point that will score lots of political points there. The media, really happy to report about the video game habits of that Norwegian guy that killed those people. Really happy to report about that because it drives a narrative and it sells advertising. I mean, this is, if you have something that people believe and you say, hey, look, be afraid of this thing that you believe, people's eyeballs will move to the screen. So what happens then is that people say we should do research. The research that supports the fear is accepted. The research that denies the fear or says that the fear isn't as big a deal is ignored by the media or by the scientific publications. And then what happens is the reporting is all about the bad stuff. It's never about the good stuff. And this just kind of turns the belief around and around and around. And that's the way video games have been going for a while now. But it has been changing recently. The example I show here, just to show what the media can do with a real scientific report. A CDC study saying that the average US gamer is overweight and depressed. This came from 2008. And this, the CDC says it, so it has some legitimacy. This is the CDC, this isn't, the Family Research Council or some sort of right-wing advocacy group. This is the CDC. But let's actually, the great thing about these press released articles is you can usually download them and read them for yourself because they want you to subscribe to the article. So sure enough, I did. And the first thing I will say is, what I've done here is I've broken it down to show you the population they're actually talking about and what it is they're talking about. So bear in mind that the headline is the average US gamer is depressed and overweight. So they took 552 adults in the Seattle-Tacoma area, aged 19 to 90. So I've had to modify this. This is actually the average adult gamer in Seattle. So this is not a national thing like the CDC would make it suggest. It was research done in 2006, so we know that our 2006 gamers very much like 2012 gamers. No, probably not. Gaming is becoming more and more mainstream. So I think there's going to be less and less of an effect of, this is a different group of people than the average person. The men who played games weighed more on average than non-gamers, and the women were found to have higher levels of depression. So now I've divided it up even again to the males and the females, the way the article actually says. Ooh, that does not look good. I apologize for that. Okay, so I'm not sure why it's showing up like that. The average male gamer had an increase in their BMI, which is a standard way of measuring your body to mass index. 20 being normal, 25 being the upper edge of normal, 28 plus being obese or so. So the average adult male had a higher score of 1. But everybody in the study was overweight, actually. The average for both groups was about 28. The gamers was about 28.7. The non-gamers was 27.9. The average female gamer scored 1.5 out of 30 on a scale of depression. And the average non-gamer scored 0.9 out of 30. Both groups totally not depressed. Actually, there was nobody in the entire study that met criteria for depression. So, I want you to compare, and I apologize for the formatting, I'm not sure why it's showing up like that, but look at what this study article, what the headline says, and look what the journal actually showed. So there's a really that significant difference in depression in female gamers, and there's a little bit more weight in gamers, but the headline makes it look really, really big deal. And so this media narrative just keeps coming, and I don't have to go back very far to find things. School violence is more likely. Youth are carrying guns in Cincinnati, so don't go to Cincinnati, I guess. Horror at the Wisconsin State Fair. So all this stuff about kids and guns, and this is actually a really sensitive thing. I realized that the States was pretty profoundly affected by the Newtown Massacre. And I hope that's something that could turn into something major, but it's really important to look at this graph, which is school shootings in the past 15 years. And this is the number of deaths that occur at or related to school in the past 15 years. And certainly with Newtown, and I apologize I don't have a pointer, there's going to be a blip, maybe it'll go up to 63. But it's actually not that different every year. Schools aren't getting more dangerous. The kids aren't more at risk for being killed by guns. None of those stuff is true. This is a really important thing to realize because the media narrative is you have to be scared. You can't go out. Your kids can't be safe. Schools are not safe. There should be metal detectors, and all this type of stuff. But really, there's no difference in the violence at school. In fact, if you look at school victimization rates, so kids being assaulted, this is what I've broken down. These are actually kids who have been physically assaulted, including major assaults where the child was either killed or seriously injured. You can see that actually things are decreasing. Kids are getting safer and safer at school. But does anybody hear that in the media today? Absolutely not. That's not part of the moral panic. That's not being reported. You never hear, today in the news, things are getting better. Actually, I did media training because I'm starting to do this spokesman stuff for the hospital I work at. And one of the things they said is, if you ever want to do something positive, try and say it, let's do it as a lighter side, because at the end of every news broadcast, they'll always show some squirrels water skating or water skiing or some chimpanzee that picks its butt, and they're like, aha, laugh at this. They always like to add at the very end of the newscast something to lift your spirits, but the first 28 minutes, they're just punching you in the face repeatedly. So maybe there would be a time then to report on that. But this is really just highlighting the media and moral panic about school violence is discordant with reality. This is not a more violent world. Actually, the more evolved we get as a species, the less violent we get. And all measures of violence have been decreasing steadily since the late 80s. So the media versus reality. Now, I had my friend walking around with a sign about Jack Thompson saying he doesn't want you to see this. A few people, when I was sort of following behind, just to hear what the response was. A few people were like, he's not relevant anymore. And the good news, he really isn't relevant anymore. There's nothing that Jack Thompson has done of importance for a long time. And actually, he didn't actually. That's actually not fair to say. He was actually a pretty important figure, and I'll say that in a second. But he was disbarred. He's no longer a lawyer, and so his Batman signatures no longer carry as much weight as they used to. People may or may not know that he signed everything with the Batman, and that's how he addressed his letters. But he did leave a legacy, and this is the unfortunate part. He did really advance this negative propaganda about video games. If there was ever a media report on violence in video games, you'd see Jack Thompson's face being interviewed, talking about the DualShock controller provides operant conditioning for violence and stuff, and you're like, dude, that's not even psychology. You're using the word operant wrong. Or he'll say something outlandish like the Japanese are trying to train our kids to take us over like Pearl Harbor, and he says all this ridiculous stuff. But he was professionally trolling. I mean, that's one of the things he was doing. But B, he actually believed in this. This is something he believed in, and he was really happy to report on it. He got his start in the late 80s about gangster rap. He was all against NWA and Dr. Dre and things like that. Yeah, so I mean, he's made his name about violence affecting our kids for a long time. I don't think he doesn't believe the stuff that he says, but he said some pretty ridiculous stuff, and it was reported. It's very hard to find a legitimate article about media violence and it not say something about Jack Thompson. It's just hard to do. But here we go. So the rate of violent crimes by youth per year. And for the gamers in the crowd, what I've done is I've broken it down by when the game was released. The violent game du jour, the thing that Jack Thompson would rail against, or some other political talking head. So Mortal Kombat came out in 1991, and we can see the rates of violence. Doom, uh-oh, things are getting worse. No, never mind, it was just a clip. Duke Nukem, Grand Theft Auto, Bully, Modern Warfare 2. And what we see is that despite the use of more and more violence in games, more realistic violence, things are actually getting much better with respect to youth violence. The murder rate is way down. The murder rate has been, down forever. And the important thing about this, I'll talk about a little bit in the science section, but the claim is out there that video games cause violence. And we know that, for example, smoking causes lung cancer. If there was 99% of the universe smoking, we would expect that lung cancer rates would go up. It doesn't have to be true for a correlation to be true, but we would expect it. So it's very hard for me to digest the idea that video games cause violence in the face of declining violence. Not that it proves it, but it just goes against common sense. So here's this rate of common crimes, and what I actually do here is I'm going to animate it out to 1980 and show you that really there was crack cocaine. I mean, that's one of the biggest causes of violence in the mid-90s was the proliferation of crack cocaine down into the inner cities. Kids killing kids because kids were the drug runners and kids were the gun runners. Kids were the mules for everything that the cowardly gangs did. And so we saw a huge increase in violent crime in that time, but really things are back to the way they were. And I always tell parents today that we're no less violent or more violent than we were in 1980. It's exactly the same. Nothing's really changed. By the way, that's Canada. I know, it's kind of rubbing it in, but the important thing here, that I always say this, because actually my primary interest is in suicidology. If you remove guns from the equation, you guys look exactly like Canada. Literally, if you take out gun deaths, the graphs totally hug the Canadian line, like completely, whether we're talking about suicide, whether we're talking about homicide. The big difference between Canada and America is guns, and it seems to me like one of the main causes of the increased rate of death. And so all this stuff about these politicians that are really trying to change the gun debate a little bit and say, actually, the NRA is not that powerful. I don't think anybody here in the room would be object to, advocating a little bit more for, write your congressman, let's get guns out of kids' hands. I mean, it's a really important thing. I come down here, bulletproof vests, so I'm a little bit thicker. I will say, we could actually make the claim that maybe video games are causing increased violence. Ours are slightly increasing every year. So maybe Canada, the science would support it. But why doesn't it work? Youth violence has actually decreased since 1980, despite all of these, I hate to, sorry if you're a Republican, but these typical Republican talking points. Decreased two-parent families has gone from 77 to 66%. Births to single mothers has gone from 18 to 40%. Children living in poverty hasn't changed, so it's not that we're getting, we're just treating our poor people better. Or increased using video games. I'm pretty sure that 99% of kids now play video games. That's what most of the data shows. So despite all of these things, and certainly video games are more violent. Despite all these things, youth violence is low. So all of these stupid talking points that you just hear end on end on end, we just have to strengthen the family and that gay people can't get married and all this type of stuff, it has no basis in reality. Things are less violent than they used to be. But I will say correlation doesn't equal causation. This is a little bit of science 101 for some people. Sorry if this is a little bit elementary for you guys. But the three reasons that you can't say, hey look, things are going down and video games are going up, so video games aren't a problem, is it could be the common variable. Very famously in 2005, the Journal of Pediatrics published an article stating that night lights cause nearsightedness in kids. And it was shown, statistically significant, clinically significant, really big deal. And people started freaking out. Researchers did a second analysis and they said, actually we don't see this at all. And they were trying to figure out why one study was so clear and the other study wasn't. It turns out that the first study didn't control for the sight of the parents. And what it was parents who were nearsighted were more likely to put night lights in their kids' bedrooms so they wouldn't fall on the way out. And so it was just the genetic transmission of their nearsightedness, that it wasn't actually anything other than that. B can actually cause A. For example, if I said that, oh look, in Vancouver the downtown east side is full of crime and there's 3 police stations there. Police stations cause crime. Actually no, it's probably there's that many police stations there because there's so much crime there. So it could be that B causes A. And it could also be coincidence. If I said pirates have decreased or vinyl album sales have decreased and violence has gone down, I could make that thing. So it could just be coincidence. But what does the science say? So there is actually a really well-published group out of Iowa State University, and I do slag on them a little bit in this talk, which I would apologize for if I haven't met them and seen the sort of hubris that they have. They are a very well-published group. A couple of them work out of Iowa State University. Dr. Anderson, I think Dr. Gentile, Dr. Huseman, and Dr. Strasburger as well, have published hundreds of articles. They host students and sponsor their PhDs, and out of their group come many, many, many articles on violence, video games, and kids. They've said some pretty outlandish stuff, like there's a greater relationship to video games and violence than there are to smoking and lung cancer, which is pretty outlandish, but they'll say that, really, and they'll say things like the matter is closed, the debate is over, there is no question that. There's lots of things that as a scientist really piss me off. You don't say that stuff, like the speed of light may be 360 meters per second meters per second, right? It's not always that when we test it. So it really bothers me when people are so equivocal about, or so emphatic about these things. For some reason, the American Academy of Pediatrics in 2005 put out a statement stating that over 3,500 studies have been done and only 18 of them have not shown an effect of violence on video games, or video games on violence. And we've asked, and Dr. Chris Ferguson, who I'll be talking about later, who really is a hero in the scientific community, has asked for, where'd you get the 3,500 number from? We've never figured it out. The largest meta-analysis of these studies in the last 20 years has been 300 studies. And when you do that sort of meta-analysis, a lot of them show negative effects, as in it doesn't cause violence. So this number just seems to be pulled out of some politician's ass. It doesn't have any basis in reality. But fortunately, it's been a little bit more fractured. The science actually is pretty limited. I'm going to go over a scientific experiment that shows that video games cause violence in a second. And I'll show you why it's so limited. So measures of aggression. How do we measure aggressive? For example, there's the noise blast study, where you're put in a room, you're given headphones, and you're told to compete in a game. And you're supposed to react quickly to a noise. And if you win, someone's going to blast you with noise. If they win, they're going to blast you with noise. But they don't know they're playing against a computer. And what they're actually measuring is how aggressive are you with the volume of the noise you give to this fake person. So it's called the noise blast study. And it's never been shown that the noise blast study correlates to someone punching somebody in the face or murdering somebody later on down the road. But this is the study of aggression that is often the outcome in these aggression studies. This is my favorite one, explode blank. Fill in the letter, and then they'll say, people who play video games were more likely to put D in the blank as opposed to R. And it's really, that's a measure of aggression. There is a study, there's a lot of studies that have peers rank the other kids from 1 to 30. Who's the most aggressive person in your class? 1 to 30. But of course, what if nobody in the class is really that aggressive? The person 1 is going to look super, super, super aggressive, and the person 30 is not going to look that aggressive. But again, these are the types of methodologies that they use. And it's generally been found that the more validated the study, like they use something like, did so-and-so punch somebody else? That's a pretty obvious measure of aggression. That never shows an effect of violence from video games. But if they show some non-validated study, like the noise blast or the explode, explore question, that does show an effect of violence. And so there's this trend towards the more validated measure leads to a less effect on aggression. The third variable is one that I struggle with all of these articles that I read, because, and I'll show the example I'll give, you know, sometimes you're wondering, are they just describing people who play video games versus people who don't play video games? Their brains are different. It makes sense to me that their brains are different. There's no reason their brains shouldn't be different because they're engaging their brain in a different way. And they don't control for the variables that might be interesting for aggression, like, are your parents aggressive people? Have you ever witnessed a fight? Have you ever been in a fight? Do you come from a low-income place where there's more likely to be violence? These would be really interesting things to control for before you do the research claiming that violence is caused by the video game. And a lot of the recent articles I'm showing there are recently scientists going, wait a second, none of these articles are looking for the third variable. None of these articles are looking at basic scientific stuff like what we call regression analysis, where we take all the known factors, we strip them away and see what's left. A lot of these studies don't do that. Publication bias. This is where Dr. Anderson has a real problem with me. He's basically the voice of the American Psychological Association. Everything he says about violence is what the American Psychological Association says about violence. And is anybody here a psychology major? How many of you are told you're going to have to produce to make it? You have to produce literature. You have to show stuff. And there is a huge pressure to produce, to be published. And nothing gets thrown out the window quicker than, I studied these two things and couldn't find an effect. But if you show, I demonstrated an effect, then you're going to get published for sure. Because A, it advances the media moral panic, and B, it's more interesting. It's more interesting to hear about something causing something else than something didn't cause something else. And that's what we call publication bias. A recent review by Chris Ferguson showed that publication bias is just rampant in the violence of video games publishing. And there's lots of reasons for that. Small effect size. So if you can show that something causes something, you should also be able to demonstrate what's the effect on things. And the word effect size is a scientific word we use. Sorry if I'm getting a little wonky here, but a scientific effect of less than 0.2 would be not really much of an effect. 0.2 to 0.4 is moderate, 0.4 and above is strong, maybe 0.6 and above is pretty significant. And it's hard to find any meta-analysis of video games and violence that shows an effect size anything above 0.2. Even when you read Dr. Anderson's stuff, his effect size is pretty small. And when we rank, you know, where violence in video games playing shows to have an effect on aggression, we see that it actually pales in comparison to the things that we already know about aggression, like genetic influences, whether or not you own a firearm, how aggressive is your personality to begin with. childhood physical abuse or witnessed abuse. All of these things have a much greater effect. Violence in video games on aggression, I put in air quotes there, because that's the noise blast, that's the explode, explore thing. That's not actually punching people. Serious aggressive behavior, the effect size is 0.04. That's no effect whatsoever. So it looks to be a very low effect size. Low standards of evidence. It really bothers me when I see those statements. The matter is closed, the debate is over. Almost every article I'll read from Dr. Anderson, Huseman, Strasburger, all of these people, is that this debate is over. It's not even worth arguing anymore. And it's such an unscientific thing. It's really, really annoying to read. The lack of developmental perspective. Most of these studies are done on psych students. Who's here in Psych 101 has had to actually participate in an experiment as part of your class? Right. So these guys who are teaching in a university, they recruit Psych 101 kids who wants to get a credit in their score. Often the Psych 101 kids maybe be trying to predict the effect that they're looking for. It might bias them. But also, we're talking about kids. The thing that they're advocating is kids are more likely to be more violent. And we're taking college-age people and studying it and saying, look, the effect of kids. Brains change over time. The frontal lobe isn't fully cooked until you're about 24. Before that, your brain is constantly changing. So this idea that studying college-age kids is going to provide great insight into children is pretty misguided. And a lot of the studies that Anderson and Gentile put out are actually done on college-age kids. So here we go. This is the title of the article that I'm going to dissect for you guys here. This is your brain on violent video games. Whoa, catchy. Neural desensitization, less catchy. Okay. They took 2,000 subjects. They asked them, how violent are your games? What are your 5 favorite games? How many hours do you play? And they divided these kids into, by the way, college-age kids, into 2,000, into 4 groups. Tons of video games, tons of violent video games, all the way down to a few violent video games. So they took 35 people out of the play lots of violent video games group, and they took 35 people out of the play very few violent video games group, which I indicated with curve. Then they put little EEG hats on them. That's what an EEG hat looks like. And they recorded their brain waves. And then what they did is they showed them a really violent picture like that. And then they recorded what the response was on the brain. And this is what they showed. They showed that people who played lots of violent video games had less of an amplitude response on the P3 area of the brain compared to the people who didn't play violent video games. Which is interesting. It's certainly a significant difference. You can actually visually see that there. But what does that mean? It shows the P3 reaction on the EEG. What does that mean in real life? There's no indication whatsoever that the P3 region is indicated in aggression or anything like that. It was just the area that they found that reacted that way the most. So they literally searched around the brain, they saw that big difference, they go, there, P3 region different. So therefore, violence is caused by video games. And then they did do a second study where they took those blunted response people and had them do the noise blast. And sure enough, they blasted more noise. And so I guess this is proof that, that noise blast means these people are more sociopathic. The group study was the Psych 101 students. They were recruited straight out of their psychology class. And they didn't do any control for third variables. Have you ever witnessed someone putting a gun in somebody's mouth before? Might be important to know if you're going to actually show them a picture of that, right? But they didn't, obviously. It's rare that I quote Schwarzenegger in anything scientific, but I shall. I don't do an Arnold, I apologize. This case actually came before the Supreme Court. What it was the ESA was being sued by the California government under Governor Schwarzenegger. Actually, it was a previous governor. Governor Schwarzenegger inherited it and then dropped it, even though it had already come to court. So it had his name on it, even though he didn't support it. It was actually decided on in 2011. What's really interesting is the courts decided 7-2 that there actually wasn't very much compelling evidence that video games cause violence. And the Supreme Court, a conservative-dominated Supreme Court, Justice Anton Scalia, who is like super conservative, this is what he wrote. The research primarily relies on the research of Dr. Greg Anderson. These studies have been rejected by every court to consider them. And he admits that the same effects have been found when children watch cartoons starring Bugs Bunny or the Roadrunner. Nearly all of the research is based on correlation, not evidence of causation, and most of his studies suffer from significant admitted flaws in the methodology. So that's the Supreme Court saying that. And why is there scientific controversy? Why can't there be some scientific organization that says, you know, this science actually isn't looking that good? But the APA, if you go to their website right now and you look at violence in video games, it'll say almost every study conducted shows that violent video games cause violence. It says that right now on the American Association of Psychologists. And this causes a really interesting back and forth. So this is kind of like a pissing match in science. It's really fun to watch. I'm glad I'm not part of it because I get really annoyed waiting for it to be published. But basically I have articles like this saying, hold on, it doesn't look like the science is very good here. And then a letter from the Anderson group saying, hey, we're going to respond to that. Chris Ferguson, Chris Ferguson writing, careful, we don't want to overstate this. Dr. Anderson, of course, gets very upset and says, actually, this is really true. I've now done a meta-analysis, take that. Dr. Ferguson replies, oh, this is much ado about nothing. This is estimation and overinterpretation of violent video games. That's a smackdown in the scientific world. And of course, they replied, much ado about something not as original. I'll say that this is a lot of points for originality. But what's really interesting is this back and forth has been going, but you know, if Craig Ferguson posts this stuff, if you search for Craig Ferguson articles, he posts all of his PDFs up there. Everything he's ever submitted for publication, whether or not it's been accepted or not, is free and available. And he has great meta-analysis on these things. Great, you know, he talks about the moral panic, he talks about the limitations on the video games, he talks about the real science. But his response to this has created really the most embarrassing paper I've ever reviewed. This is incredible. This is an actual published thing. Do violent video games harm children? Comparing the CV, so basically comparing our published reports of the experts. So this is Chris Anderson saying, I've published more than Craig Ferguson here, so you should listen to me. This is humiliating. I don't know if Craig Anderson knows how humiliating this is, but it's ridiculous to see. He's literally saying, I've published so much, there's no reason you should listen to this other guy. That's not how science works. Science works by somebody trying to disprove something. Science works by someone saying, actually the evidence doesn't support this. When people say things like, oh, you know, evolution is only a theory, people don't understand what the word theory means. It means it's never been refuted in science. There's never been a scientific study that goes against the theory. So when you say things like, violence causes video game, or video games cause violence, I always say that, it's hard to keep it straight. Video games cause violence, and yet there's all this evidence that shows that maybe it doesn't. You're looking scientifically rather dim. And this type of thing just shows me that there's ego involved. There's someone who's put his entire career on making this case who is just not being reasonable. This is a ridiculous paper. Actually, I've written him to tell him that. He didn't reply. So the importance of this type of thing is when somebody's ego gets involved and the science doesn't support it, what ends up happening is you have to start changing your position. And sure enough, in 2013, I've been seeing a lot more publications by Craig Anderson saying things like, we need to examine the pro-social and the anti-social effects of video games. And he's starting to add in all this language. I know in like 3 years he's going to come back like Mark Sanford and be like, what Appalachian Trail? So I'm sure it's going to turn around and he's going to come back and start saying, actually, there's more to say about video games. What was that? So really, there's actually only been two major studies on video games and violence. One showed a minimal effect. The other showed a major effect. That was Dr. Anderson's meta-analysis. His meta-analysis showed a major effect of 0.4, which is actually pretty significant. When Chris Ferguson reviewed his paper and actually accounted for publication bias, it dropped down to 0.17. So it seems to me like most of what we're seeing is that video games are not a contributor to violence, or if they are, it's a small effect. Chris Ferguson has been publishing really excellent peer-reviewed journals. Fortunately, he's been able to publish them openly without needing this pressure to publish by the APA and show something significant. Recently, the Australian and Swedish governments have reviewed this like fully and said, you know what, there's not a lot of evidence showing that video games cause violence. And there's a clear direction that maybe the science is turning on this, and we're going to start seeing a difference here. The reality is that if 99% of video gamers out there are kids, 97% of the kids are video games, and they cause violence, we're all screwed. We're all going to get killed. But we're not seeing that at all. You go to something like PAX, and you see I'd love to do a study comparing the crime rate at PAX to a political convention. I'd love to do that. Yeah, it's not a funding question. It really is just access to statistics. I probably should do it. Because, I was reading on Twitter, someone said, I lost my iPad. And it was like an engraved iPad or something like that. And someone said, oh, I found it in Lost and Found, I accidentally picked it up, I have it here. And I was watching it happen on Twitter, and I'm like, yeah, that doesn't happen in the real world. Gamers, especially, we're a group here. I come here, I get a special guest pass that lets me get access. I'd be paying for tickets if I wasn't here speaking. And we all love games. We're probably in the group that people would fear the most outside of us. Look at them dressed up like Mario and Zelda, and what's that weird thing over there? Like, these kids are really weird. These people are bizarre. But the reality is we're probably one of the nicest groups on the planet, I think. I would say when you take away our masks, when you put on the masks, you put us online, we become pretty bad. I do another talk to parents about how awful online gaming is for kids. And I will always say, I don't know if there's anybody in here who shouts out that fag stuff or all that type of stuff when you're online gaming. It's not cool. It really isn't. The bullying that happens online is kind of silly and totally pointless. Really, I love doing conclusion slides, but the science tells me that you have to draw your own conclusions at this point. I've told you, most of the studies show a small effect. One of the studies shows a somewhat major effect, but there's reasons to doubt it, and the science just simply isn't in. So that being said, I started early, I'm finished early, so if people want to start going to panels, I'm happy to start taking questions. I think there might be a mic or something like that. And then we'll clear out of here a few minutes early. I did leave some business cards if anyone wants to send me an email later. All right, thanks so much, guys.